Okay, hi class. Let's get started with our first sort of Photoshop activity. We're going to be creating this sphere here, okay, and we're going to be doing it in Photoshop, obviously. Once you're done this, I'm going to walk you through all the steps for this. You're going to be doing an extension activity, which is a bowling ball. I'm also going to be talking about some of the interface elements that you should start paying attention to, and those are things like, where things are, what things are called. Some of the keyboard shortcuts I'll be referring to are ones that you'll be using a lot of. So pay attention to those, okay? Keep a note of those. You'll start to hear some of those same terms and keyboard shortcuts over and over, and they're going to increase your sort of comfort level and increase your speed with the software. Okay, so Photoshop. We are going to, you'll recognize this, okay, if you click on, now I'm not sure what software you're using. I'm using Adobe Photoshop CC 2019. Depending on where we are and when this video was made and what you have, you may have an updated version of this. That's okay. It should be very similar. There may be some small changes, but you should be able to keep up, okay? So click on Create New. It's going to give us this. You should recognize this from Illustrator. Okay, Illustrator gives us the same kind of setup with some presets. We're going to go to Web, and we're going to choose, as I mentioned in the previous video, 1920 by 1080, which is called 1080p. I'm going to click on this. Now notice that there are some options here. Okay, I can change the orientation. So right now it's 1920 by 1080 in, so width is 1920. I can change my orientation. Okay, so that's going to be landscape. And I'm going to switch that back to, sorry, landscape or portrait. Okay, I'm going to change that back to landscape. There is the resolution that I mentioned. Okay, we're going to leave that at 72. In fact, we're not going to change anything else. Everything, all of these settings are fine. So just check that, web large, and then hit create. Okay, so here's our first image. Our first artboard. Okay, so a couple of things. Because you're opening Photoshop probably for the first time, you'll probably get this layout, something like this. Okay, now we're not going to need all these because I'm going to be running you through a lot of these, but you are welcome to leave this any way you want. Okay, I have modified my workspace a little bit because there are a few things that I'll be using over and over. You can change yours to match mine. It's up to you. Okay, you now know that by going up here to window, now you probably can't see this because it's outside of the video area, but from window you can go down and you can open any of the palettes, okay, that exist, okay, and those will show up here, okay. So you should know that from Illustrator, and you should also know that you can take these palettes and close them or realign them, minimize them, put them wherever you want depending on your workflow. Now your workflow is your workflow, so whatever works for you is fine. Depending on how many of these you want open, you can dock or undock these depending on the way you want to work, and I leave that to you. Okay, I've set up a design layout that I want to use, which is the layers palette, the history palette, and a couple others that we'll get into later. But these are the two I want to talk about mostly in this, that I'll be using mostly in this tutorial. Okay, so first I want to talk a little bit about history. Now I'm going to use a couple tools here, so let's take a quick look at the toolbar. You'll recognize some of these. You'll recognize the zoom tool, the pan tool. There are some arrows that will look similar to what we used in Illustrator, although they work differently here. Or more accurately, we don't use them in the same way. There's that pen tool, and there's some type tool here. A couple you probably won't recognize, but then there's a gradient and an eraser and a brush tool, which again you probably won't use much of here. Anyways, there are a lot here. There are also, which is another crossover between the Adobe software, these little triangles, okay? And the triangles give us, as you remember, flyout menu, which are a number of other tools related to the tool that is being used, okay? Sometimes if you change, say you change to the magic wand tool here, and I'm talking about the quick mask tool, the sort of the quick selection tool. Remember that that is here. That's going to be sometimes hidden, okay? But the nice thing is that the keyboard shortcut is the same. So if I'm talking about, say I'm talking about the magnetic lasso tool, and I say hit L on your keyboard, it's going to go to whichever one of these is selected. Okay, so if I change to this and hit L on my keyboard, it's going to go here. So whichever one I'm talking about, you'll know that I'm talking about one of the tools in here. Okay, moving on. So as I mentioned, the history palette. The history palette records sort of all the steps that you make. So I'm going to, for example, go here and click on the brush, and I'm going to just do a little squiggle here, and you can see it adds to my history a brush tool. Okay, I'm going to do it again, and it adds another brush tool, and I'm going to do it again, and adds another brush tool. Now, if I change to another tool, I go to the pen tool, and I start clicking, it's going to record each of those moves in my history. Okay, now this history is only valid for the file that I am using. If I close this file, or I save this file and then close it, it is not going to keep my history. When I close and open this file, there will be no recorded history. It's only sort of for every sort of open and close sort of use of the file, there's a history associated with it. Okay, so keep that in mind. Say you make some changes and you close your file and then you're like, oh, you know what, I think I want to change that, and you open it up, that history's gone. Okay, it's been committed. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so I'm gonna, but because I haven't closed this, I can go back in my history and I can undo each of these steps back to the point where I have a new document. And if I now make a selection, you'll see it's going to overwrite this history with a new history. Okay, great. We'll go back to here. This is our blank document, nothing in it. Okay, so let's get started with kind of working our way around the interface here. So the tools. One of the tools you're going to be using is, and again, the keyboard shortcut is Z on your keyboard. Okay, it's going to give you the zoom tool, and a little bit different depending on which version of Photoshop you have, but if you drag to the right and drag to the left, it's going to zoom in or out. That's called, I think it's called scrubby zoom, and there's a way to turn it off, but I can't remember where it is. Anyways, if you like that, you can keep it on, or there's a way to turn it off, and you can Google that. Okay, otherwise you can click once to zoom in, or holding Option on your keyboard, or Alt if you're on a PC, and click and it'll zoom out. Okay, there are some keyboard shortcuts which you probably remember. Command plus will zoom in, or on a PC it's Control plus, and Command minus or Control minus on a PC. Okay, Command 1 will take you to 100%. Command 0 will take you to fill the screen that you are working in. Okay, so again, Command 1, 100%. Command 0 fills your screen. Command minus zooms out. Command plus zooms in. Okay, or you can just scrub and zoom in on the area that you want. Okay, all right, Command 1, 100%. There's the pan tool, which you should remember, okay, or the hand tool, okay, and if I had another tool selected, okay, I can hold spacebar. That is the same as in Illustrator, where I can readjust my position and then let go of the space key, or you can go to your hand tool, which is H on the keyboard, okay, and we're going to look at, for our first sort of lesson today, we're going to be looking at using the elliptical marquee tool. Okay, so you need to click on the marquee tool and drag down to elliptical marquee. Okay, now before we do anything, let's just talk about this. Now you'll remember that this looks similar to Illustrator, but this works differently because in Illustrator we had an outline and a fill, or a stroke and a fill. That's not the way Photoshop works. Okay, Photoshop, as I mentioned in the last tutorial, is all based on raster, so it's all pixels. So there's no math involved in. I mean, you can bring vector files into Photoshop and you can work in vector, but typically what we're going to be doing is going to be raster based, which is photo based, pixel based imagery. Okay, and so the way these work are, this is your foreground color and this is your background color. Okay, and so depending on what you're doing, you'll be using these in different ways. Okay, now there's a reset here to go back to your default settings. If I hit D on my keyboard, okay, it sets it back to the default colors. If I hit X on my keyboard, this switches foreground and background. Okay, and just like in Illustrator, I can double click and I can pick a new color. Okay, this gives me kind of all the colors of the rainbow, and I hit OK, and that updates my color. Okay, so let's pick a kind of a green like that. I'm gonna hit OK. There's my green color. This is my foreground color. Let's talk about what that means. I've got right now one layer. Okay, there's only one layer in my file. So if I say edit and I say fill with foreground color, it's going to fill my whole artboard with that color green, okay? Because that's my foreground color. Let's go back to my history one step, and now I'm going to go edit, and I'm going to fill with my background color, and now that's white, so actually let me change that. If I double click this and make it a different color like this, pale red, okay, I'll try that again, edit, and I'm going to fill with my background color. It's going to fill it with that pale red, okay? Now, I'm going to undo that again, go back to here. So those two colors are foreground and background, and they are used for different things. We'll learn more about that as we go. I mentioned that I've got one layer here. Now, the way I like to explain layers is if you think about a transparent sheet of paper, or a transparent, like the transparencies that are used on like overhead projectors in the olden days, okay? Like a clear piece of plastic with nothing on it. If I had two layers, that's like having a transparency over top of another transparency. Okay, we've got a white background because when we open this file, we said specifically that we wanted it set to white. If you remember, I went file, when I went file new, it gave me the option when I opened up when it gave me the properties, it said, do you want this to have a white background, which is here. I can select this as black or any of these options here, okay, if I want. But for now, what's happening is it's a white background image, okay? So keep that in mind. These two have nothing on them though, okay? So you'll see this little checkboard thing. There's nothing that's actually on these layers, okay? All right, so I'm gonna delete layer 2 for now, and we'll talk more about how all of this works as we move through the software. Okay, so let's get back to our colors here. What we're going to be creating is a circle. Okay, you saw in the tutorial here that we were going to be creating this graphic here. Okay, so let's look at how we do that. If you look at this elliptical marquee tool that I mentioned, and you click and you drag, it looks in a lot of ways similar to Illustrator. Okay, it has the same keyboard shortcut. Holding Shift will constrain it. Okay, and if I put my cursor inside that selection, I can move it over. Okay, if I click outside of it, it's going to make a new selection. Okay, so click away, hold Shift, and then move into position. Now this is actually not any kind of graphic. I've not drawn anything on my artboard in this layer. All this is selecting part of my screen and saying, hey Photoshop, I care about this part and I don't care about this part. So if you remember when I filled my whole screen, I went edit and I said fill, it filled my whole screen with my foreground color. But now that I've made a selection and I'm telling, hey Photoshop, I care about this part, if I say fill with foreground color, it's only going to fill the part that I care about because I've told Photoshop, hey Photoshop, I only care about this. Okay? If I then make another selection here and I say edit fill with background color, it's only going to fill this part of the selection because that's the part that I care about. Okay? Now that I've got a selection, I can either click outside of here or I can go select, deselect, or Command D, which will deselect my selection. Okay? And we'll talk more about this as we go through. Let's go back in our history to the beginning, or we're back in our empty space here. So you're going to go to your elliptical marquee. You're going to make a circle, hold Shift, and then you're going to try and center it somewhere in your workspace, your artboard. Okay, I'm getting this little guide here, which tells me when I'm centered. It keeps disappearing. Anyways, I'm gonna leave it there. There, I got it. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna fill this. Now, I filled it with a solid color, but that's not what I want to do. What I want to do is I want to fill it. If you look at the graphic here, it's a gradient. So let's look at how that works. Okay, what I need to do is I need to have my green color as a background color. So I'm going to switch these, okay, and then I'm going to double click on this red color. And what's going to happen is it's going to give me this eyedropper tool. You can see that I can now pick up other colors using my eyedropper tool. Well, what I want to do is I want to pick up this green, okay, and what that's going to do is it's going to apply the green here. Okay, it's going to say, okay, there's the green that you talked about, and I'm going to say I want a variant of that which is going to be a little bit lighter, like this. Okay, so now I've got a foreground light green and a background dark green. Okay, I might make that a little darker. I'll go down to here. Okay, and there's my gradient. Okay, actually, in fact, I'm going to make this a little darker as well, but it doesn't make a big difference. Okay, now I'm going to go to my gradient tool, which is here. And what you'll see here is we have a gradient that starts at my foreground color and goes to my background color. There are a lot of different presets here. Typically, we won't use any of these. Typically, we only use the foreground to background or foreground to transparency. But just note what happens here. If I flip these, it goes to my background to foreground flip, and now it's going from dark to light. Okay, so this here affects what happens here. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, there are these sub-menus. Depending on what tool I have, I've got this sub-menu that shows up. Well, I'm using a gradient, so this is the gradient sub-menu. Okay, we've got our preset selected here, and then we've got a bunch of different kind of variables and things that can change. This is a linear gradient, which means it's going to go in a line. This is a radial gradient, which means it's going to go kind of in a kind of an outwards circular manner. And then there's a couple other ones which I typically don't use. I'll show you what they do, but we very rarely use them. And then there's some other kind of settings that we can toggle on and off, which we won't use for now, but we will learn what they do later. Okay, let's look at this first. Linear. So if I click here and I drag straight across, it's going to go from my light color to my dark color in a straight line. If I go from top to bottom, again, light to dark. And depending on how far I drag, my linear gradient starts at this point and finishes at this point. Okay, so I click and I drag, and it creates a linear gradient from start to finish, whatever direction I'm making this line. Okay, great. I'm going to step back to my original elliptical marquee, and now I'm going to change to a radial gradient. Now, a radial gradient, again, very similar. It's going to start at the center and it's going to radiate outwards. Okay, so if I click in the center and I only go a little ways away, it's a small gradient. If I go farther away, it's a large gradient. If I start in this corner and go down to the bottom, it's a much larger gradient. Okay, and it only fills it in the area that I've selected. Okay, let's go back to here. I can also, so notice right now I'm drawing on the inside of my gradient, inside of my selection. Okay, I can also say by going to select inverse, notice that right now I care about what's inside of this, but if I invert my selection, you'll notice that now these little, what are called marching ants, there's a set of marching ants around the outside, because what that means is now I've told Photoshop that I don't care about this, I care about the opposite of this, which is out here. So if I drag like this, you notice that it fills outside of that selection. Okay, so just a couple of things to notice. All right, I'm going to go back to our move selection, and right now, because I went back before my inverse, I'm back to being selected inside of my elliptical selection. Okay, all right, so how do we make this thing? Well, by looking at it, you can see that it starts fairly light here, and it gets dark here in a radial fashion. So I'm going to start up here, and click and drag, not quite in the corner, but to about there, and that's going to create my sphere. Now, if you look at the one that I've got here, it's got a little bit of a highlight here. So let's take a look at how we create that. That's not a bad starting point, but we'll make it look a little bit more like it's got a specular highlight. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my colors back to black and white. I'm going to switch it so my foreground color is white. Then I'm going to go to my brush. Now let's take a look at some of the options for brushes. I've got a brush size, and I've got a brush hardness. There are a bunch of other options here that we'll get to, and we'll learn about these later, but for now, we're going to just change our brush size, okay, and you'll notice that that changes the size of the circle, okay, the brush point that I'm drawing with, okay, and there's a hardness slider. So let's start with the hardness at 100%, and let's see what this is doing. So if I click and drag, okay, it drags and draws inside of this selection area in white. Okay, I'm going to undo that. If I draw in black, you notice it's the same thing, but it doesn't draw outside of my selection. Why? Because I've told Photoshop I only care about what's in this selection. If I do want to draw outside of that, I've got to inverse my selection, and now I can draw outside only. Okay, or I could deselect, and then I can draw anywhere I want. Okay. Let's go back a few steps because I actually want to continue with this. All right, so we're back here to our gradient, and what I want to do is I want to draw in white, and I want to draw it with a larger brush. Now that's not quite large enough, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit on my keyboard, there's a keyboard shortcut, the 2 square brackets. The right one makes it bigger, the left one makes it smaller. Okay, so there's my brush size. That's about the size I want, but you'll notice that we're drawing with a hard-edged brush. Okay, you can see here, this is a very hard edge. Okay, so let's undo that. I'm going to go back to my brush tool, and I'm going to change this hardness slider from 100 down to 50. Let's just see what that does. So now when I click here, okay, so you can see that the edge now is much softer. Okay, there's a 50% kind of dither, it's called a dither, between where it starts and where it finishes. Okay, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go back to my brush, and I'm going to try again. I'm going to go down to 0. Okay, and obviously this is going to have a softer edge. Okay, I'm going to undo that. I'm going to bump my brush up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to make it, it's at 300 now. I'm going to bump it up to about, maybe about there. Okay, I'm not sure what that's 400. Okay, and I feel like this is a little bit harsh. So I'm going to turn my opacity down to 40%. Okay, and now when I click, that gives me a little bit of a softer opacity, and I can click a couple times without being as harsh, and that gives me kind of a bit more control over how bright or dark I want that. Okay, so I'm going to go to here in my history. I might actually bring this back down to about, say, 200. Okay, and I'm going to just put a little specular highlight right in the center there. And then I'm going to bump my size up again. I'm going to switch to black and bring my opacity right down to 10%. And I'm just going to put like a little, so you can see I'm drawing in 10% here. I'm going to just put like a little soft shadow here, okay, which creates a little bit of depth in my sphere. And I'm done. So I go select, deselect, and I'm finished. Okay, so that's a fairly simple introduction to the interface. What I would like you to do now is, now that you kind of have that concept, I'd like you to try and do the same thing. So you're gonna do this, and you're gonna save this as a JPEG on your to put on your Wix portfolio, and you're also going to do a bowling ball. Now, bowling ball is going to be very similar, except instead of being green, it's going to go from, it's going to use probably a light gray or maybe even a dark gray to black, and then there are going to be some circles, which are going to be here. Okay, remember when I made my green circle and my red background circle? Well, you're going to create 3 circles, okay, that are going to be filled in with black. Okay, give that a shot and see how that goes. All right, let me just walk you through saving. So this is going to be pretty similar to what you do in Illustrator, but instead of exporting, you're just going to go to File, and you're going to go Save to save your PSD, which is your Photoshop document, and Save As to save your output file. So first, let's save our file by going Save. It's going to ask me, notice you have documents, and I'm going to say, I'm going to call this screen, or maybe we'll call it sphere. Why is it screen? So sphere, oh, I read screen, that's why I said screen. Sphere 01, okay, and if I save that, that'll save. Make sure that this is selected as a Photoshop document, okay? And then also, I'm going to go File, Save As, and from the drop down here, I'm going to say JPEG, and then I'm going to give this, downloads again, okay, and, or documents, and I'm going to name this again sphere, okay, or 1. You're going to call this one sphere, call the other one bowling ball, and you're going to put both of them on your Wix site. Make sure that this is a JPEG, okay? You could also make it a PNG, but JPEG is fine in this instance, okay? That's it. Oh, the other thing is, when you do save this, it'll ask you the quality, and you can save it at a quality of 10. That's fine. Okay, there's a slider here, but 10 is fine. And hit OK, and you're done. All right, guys. I hope that all makes sense, and I hope you're excited about learning some Photoshop. I'll talk to you very soon.